So let's start this interview off with why track and field or athletics?
Yeah, I guess for me, I kind of fell into athletics or track and field somewhat by accident. I was always like a very active kid. I actually started out in equestrian when I was quite young, and that was what I did for years. And then when I was in grade six, so I was around 12 or 13, I joined my school athletics program, and it was more or less just a fitness thing for me. It was just for fun that I joined this program, and I happened to really like it. And then I guess from there, I stuck with it, and it kind of grew really quickly for me. And I eventually started competing, and yeah, I guess everything happened within the space of a few years. So I did fall into it, but I also sort of fell into a love for it as well, which was really nice.
How did you get started with equestrian?
Yeah, so equestrian, I was really young. I think I was around 6 or 7, and my family and I used to go to a little farm stay for holidays, around like a week or two at a time, and they had horses there. And I think being, 7 or 8 years old, I was the little girl that was obsessed with ponies. um, and that was where I learned to ride. And the guy who ran the farm just kind of put me on a little Shetland pony one day and was like, right, we're going to teach you. And then from there, I went home and I got lessons, and I did that for years. And I just really loved the bond that people had with the horses, and that teamwork that comes with equestrian. So I guess that was kind of where that started. It was just a little girl love for horses.
Was there anyone that was pushing you toward those kind of athletic experiences at a young age, or was it just you trying to figure out something that you could spend your time doing?
Pretty much. My parents were and are fantastic when it comes to supporting me in what I want to do. From a very young age, it was always, we want you to do what you love for as long as you love it, and when you don't love it anymore, we're not gonna, push you to stay in that sport or that area. So, for me, I had the privilege of being able to experiment with different activities and sports that I liked, and equestrian was one, and then athletics was the next one, and um, I did athletics for a number of years before I actually took a break to finish high school, and that was the decision that I made, and my parents were fully cooperative with that. And then when I wanted to get back into sport um, in 2020 and athletics, they were really supportive of that too, and I think that made a really big difference.
And we'll get into the break that you took and then what preceded that as well a little bit later. So
Mhm.
you were 13 when you started track?
I would have been 12 when I
Oh,
started, and then
okay.
13, 14 when I started competing.
And then was that difficult to find other people to compete against?
Not really, actually. Because I started through school, there I was with a whole school program, so there were always kids that were at training with me. And then when I actually started competing, I had to be convinced a little bit to come and actually start racing. So um, here in Australia, we have a whole bunch of meets. I'm sure it's the same everywhere, where you start at sort of a school age level, and you could really start competing at 6 or 7 if you really wanted to, through like a little athletics program. So there's always opportunity to compete. So for me, the coach of the program, he approached me and sort of said, "Do you want to try racing?" When I was 12 or 13, and I was like, "No, absolutely not. I'm not doing that." Um, but he managed to convince me, and that was kind of how I got into it. But I think for me, the beauty of it was having other athletes with disabilities that I could race against, and that was the whole new world for me more than anything else.
And how did that sector of sport encourage you that there was a future in this for you?
Yeah, I guess for me, it was just knowing that I had a place that was um, wholeheartedly mine or ours in the sense of athletes with disabilities. And I think that was really special because up until then, I was training and competing against able bodied kids, which was fine. But I was always sort of resigned to the fact that, I was never going to be elite in that field. Um, and so when I discovered that not only Paralympic sport existed, but sport that was catered to even my specific disability, it felt like such a relief because I felt like I had a place where I really belonged and I could really explore what I was capable of.
Can you talk me through the difference between T35, T36, T37, and T38 in terms of what they're able to do?
Yeah, so with the cerebral palsy classifications, those are the ones that are divided into the T35, T36, 37, 38. So that's what those 30 categories are. They're cerebral palsy classes, or I guess impaired coordination classes. So for us, it can be quite a gray area. Obviously, certain disabilities look different on everybody. I mean, when you're talking about amputees, it's a lot clearer. They either have the limb or they don't. With us, cerebral palsy can affect us all differently. So the nature of these classes is to sort of differentiate between those impairment levels and I guess try to make it as fair as you possibly can. So for us, they, I guess, sort of go in order of area and degree of impairment. So a T38 would be considered least impaired, and they would also have the least number of limbs impaired. So it might be one leg, one arm, and it may not be too severe. And then you sort of just go down from there. So a 37 is a lot like a 38, but probably more impaired in that one or two limbs. 36s are a very grey category. They confuse me a little bit as well, to be honest. But that is, again, the same sort of thing. They might have 2 or 3 impaired limbs, and it could be to a more severe degree than a 37. And then 35s, which is my category, consist mostly of athletes with diplegia cerebral palsy, which just means that the cerebral palsy affects both sides of their body, and impairment can be quite severe for those athletes. So that's kind of how that works. And then any classification below that in the cerebral palsy classes would be usually wheelchair bound athletes.
And did I read it right that there's not just cerebral palsy, it's also traumatic brain injury and a lot of other injuries that have rendered an athlete relatively, I don't know what the word is exactly, but just less able-bodied as they go down. Like, it's not just a cerebral palsy class.
Yes, exactly. And that was something that even I took a few years to figure out. This is like the joys of classification. But yeah, it's essentially most acquired brain injuries that impact, I guess, your ability to sort of move. For us, it's characterized by spasticity in the muscles. So that could be from anything. One of my competitors, I'm fairly sure she acquired her disability from a car accident. So there are a range of different sort of factors that go into play. Personally, CP seems to be the most common disability that I've seen in the 30 categories, but you're right, it can be anything that impairs, I guess, muscle function in that way.
What was your childhood like
Um,
prior to sport of any kind?
yeah, I mean, it was great. It was really nice. And I think one of the great things about being a kid for me was that my parents never really treated me any differently to any other child. And I think it was really interesting for me growing up because I was diagnosed quite late. For most cerebral palsy children or athletes, it's usually very early on, and I was a little bit later. And so most of my life I spent sort of moving in a particular way or having difficulty with certain things and not really placing much value or meaning on that. I was just sort of like, I can't skip as well as those kids, and that doesn't mean anything. It was just the way it was. And then when I was diagnosed, it was very much delivered to me in a way that, you know, you have cerebral palsy, but that's not really going to change who you are or what you do. And so as a very young child, I think that was really great in sort of shaping my sense of self. It was never purely centered around disability, which I think was important to me at the time and to me now, definitely. And so when I was around, I think I was 9 or 10, my family and I actually did a 6-month trip around Australia. And it's quite funny looking back on it now because I was keen as to just get involved in anything that I could. And I had, at the time, I had these AFO sort of leg braces that I would wear, and they were covered in like butterflies and flowers. And I just thought they were the best thing ever. And looking back on it now, I remember being quite young and being really surprised when people would sort of stare or ask questions about, what was wrong with me, because to me, there was nothing really wrong with me. And I think that really shaped how I thought about sport, how I thought about Paralympic sport, and how I think about what I do now in terms of everything. For me, it's sort of about letting, I guess, disability, sport, whatever it might be, sort of complement who I am rather than sort of define everything that I do.
How important was it then that you got started with the Paralympic committee as early on as you did? I mean, you were a year into your sport.
Yeah, and I think that was what was so surreal about it. I mean, I went into it knowing very little about anything. I didn't know much about classification. I didn't know much about elite sport, let alone a Paralympic Games. So for me, it was really just a big learning experience, and I think it was for everybody who was kind of involved in my life as well. And I think that was the really cool thing about it, was that I went to my first World Championships at 14, and my only real thought going into it was, I guess I'll just do my best and see what happens. And that was really all it came down to. I think it became more complex and a little bit deeper as I got older and continued to participate in sport and figure it out a little bit more. But I think being surrounded by those athletes, being surrounded by so many different people with such unique abilities and backgrounds was fantastic for someone who was still trying to figure out who they were as a young teenager.
So prior to breaking any world records, when you first joined the Paralympic team, how did they find you and how were you received?
So I qualified automatically for my first World Championships at a nationals event. So the coach that I was working with when I was around 13, 14, he had a few athletes that he would take to a national level and compete there. So he knew a few people in terms of just, I guess, the next level of sport, if that makes sense. And so I was lucky enough that when I competed at my first nationals and qualified for the World Championships that next year, it just kind of put my name on a list, I guess. And I just sort of went through all the protocols and things that came with that. Having said that, the Paralympic committee, I think in most countries, especially in Australia, have like talent search days. And as far as I know, a lot of the young athletes that are coming through now are identified there, where they sort of have the opportunity to go and participate in sport and then, hopefully turn that into something. But for me, it sort of all happened very quickly. I sort of found myself qualifying for things before I even knew what they were. So yeah, it was a very, very strange time.
Can you talk me through from the time that you got diagnosed with CP to your first world championship? Just kind of briefly.
Yeah. I think initially there was definitely a sense of having to reckon with something that I didn't understand. I think a lot of people perceive any disability to be extreme disability. So when my parents sat me down and said, "You've been diagnosed with cerebral palsy," all I could think about was the extreme, severely impaired version of cerebral palsy that I had seen on TV, for example. And so identity-wise, I kind of looked at that and was like, well, I know that's not me. I'm not that person. So where does that sort of leave me in this category of disability? And I was quite young then, so I remember I used to walk around school and I'd have that leg brace on, and kids would sort of ask if I'd broken my leg or like what had happened. And so I think learning to explain who I was under this category of disability was really quite strange to me when I'd grown up being told that I was sort of just like every other kid, and I truly believed that. So then I think from there, finding sport, finding a space where I felt like I was, I kind of had all the agency, and like, it didn't feel like a bit of a pity invite or anything like that. It felt like a place that was solely ours. And I think for me, that changed that perception on disability. It wasn't something I had to kind of awkwardly explain. It was something that everyone looked at and went, "Yep, cool, we know what that is. Let's perceive these people more as athletes rather than just people with disabilities. So I think it was very empowering for me to find something that made me feel strong and capable and didn't reduce this idea of disability to something that just sort of said, this is what we can't do. So I think that was really important for me. And yeah, that journey through the Paralympics really helped that.
Wow. That quote is for sure going in this podcast.
Yes.
How old were you when you were officially diagnosed?
I believe I was 8 years old, 7 or 8, which yeah, was quite late. Most kids are diagnosed at birth. So yeah, I think it happened once I started sort of growing a bit more and we realized that things just kind of weren't working the way they were supposed to be. But yeah, I was young, but older than most people when they're diagnosed.
Kids are ruthless. Did you ever see that pan out, or were they just always like, this is Isis and she's our friend?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because there are only small things I remember in terms of primary school when I was initially diagnosed. I think for me, it was there was obviously the odd kid that was kind of like, "What's wrong with you? Is your leg broken?" And you sort of go, "No, I have CP." And like kids who are like 7 or 8 go, "Okay, whatever," and kind of move on, which is great. For me, it was actually more the adults that I found really hard to, I guess, process or understand or even just sort of explain things to. When I went on that trip around Australia, I wasn't at school. I was with my parents and I was camping, and I was running into a lot of families, and often it was the adults that would stare. It was the adults that would ask questions, and to be a young kid and have to explain to an adult something that they don't understand, it's a very odd situation to be in, I think. And it was that sensation of, I guess, thinking, when you're really young, you sort of think adults know everything. And so when a parent came up to me and was like, "Oh, what's wrong with you? Have you broken your leg?" And I sort of have to explain, and they sort of sit there and go, "Oh, that's interesting." It's that really caught me off guard and made me think, "Oh, like, is there something wrong with me? Like, if adults don't understand it, how, maybe it's not normal." So I think more than anything, it was that was harder to process, and anything kids said, as you say, just kind of came along with like classic kind of schoolyard talk that you get over eventually.
And then once you joined the Australian Paralympic team, you went to your first world championship and broke 2 world records. I mean, that seems insane.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely surreal. I think as I said, I went in purely with the idea that I just wanted to do my best. And so I did that. And I did that very, very simply. I didn't go in with any real sort of race plan. I hadn't had any coaching in terms of how to mentally prepare for something like that. I literally just showed up and ran 100 meters and ran 200 meters. Like, it was that simple. And I think coming away from that event and being told, you just broke 2 world records, you won 2 gold medals, I sort of like, okay, but I also just kind of did what I thought I was supposed to do. And so it wasn't until the following year, after my first World Championships and leading into my first Paralympic Games, that I really began to feel that pressure and the, I guess, the enormity of what I might have almost accidentally done. It certainly didn't feel like something I did on purpose, not then.
And that was your first overseas competition ever.
Yeah, and it was my first time traveling overseas ever. Same for my parents too, actually.
And was there any, I mean, the stakes were very low at that point. You were just kind of trying to figure out what you could do, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that was kind of the great thing about it. I almost look back on that and wish I had enjoyed that more now, because I was just a kid showing up to another competition, and I was naive and I was young enough to not know all the little things that come with being an elite athlete, because I wasn't one yet, not really. And so I think that it was a time for like a lot of learning, a lot of growing, but also just experiencing things for the first time. And I'm lucky that my opportunity to experience those things for the first time happened at a World Championships and not at a Paralympic Games, because they're two completely different events. And I think going into your first Paralympics with no previous experience of international travel, international competition, any of that is just so overwhelming for a lot of people.
Athletes train their entire lives for an Olympic experience. You had been in the sport for 2 years and you were already going to the Paralympics. I mean, what was the stress level for that?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question, because I remember 2015, my first World Championships. I was 14. I was in year 8 at school, which is our second year of high school. I had my little friendship group. I hated maths, like I was just a 14-year-old kid. And then 12 months go by and I was preparing for my first Paralympic Games, and suddenly I was being interviewed asking when I would be breaking more world records, whether or not I'd be winning gold in Rio. And at the same time, I was in year 9, where suddenly teenagers become quite fierce and quite ruthless, as you were saying. And I was also in the process by that point of moving high school. So I was in this huge phase of transition. I had a lot of pressure socially, trying to figure out what high school looked like, what it was like to be like I was 15, so it's a very interesting time. And then also I had a lot of again, a lot of adults, a lot of important people coming up to me and asking me if I would be bringing gold home for my country to Paralympics, and I didn't even know what that looked like for me. So the pressure was intense, and I think that was what made Rio stand out from all of the other comps that I've done. It was the culmination of what pressure looks like, and I think what it looks like when pressure gets to you. And that was what really sort of stuck with me afterwards. I remember leaving that event and sort of thinking, God, I wish I had gone in with a little bit more peace of mind, or a little bit more sort of comfort of some kind to sort of get me through that event. But it was almost like a teething period of you just have to do it for the first time, and it's going to be awful, it's going to be uncomfortable, and then from there you just learn. And so that's all Rio was to me. But yeah, the pressure was immense.
So you kind of talk about Rio as though it was like the very beginning of things, and you kind of went in not knowing your capabilities, but you still got 2 silvers and a bronze medal.
Yeah.
I mean, what was the reception at that point? Because now you had broken 2 world records. Now you have these tangible medals that are reiterating to you that you have something here.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, I think I felt the complete opposite in Rio. I think I went in with this expectation that I was going to win those events, and especially in these sprints events, the difference between winning and coming second is a matter of milliseconds. So I think the reception externally, eventually, and also probably immediately, it just didn't feel like it at the time, was hugely congratulatory, and people were so happy for me, and it was a very exciting time. And everyone was sort of saying, you're so young and it's your first Paralympics and you've got 2 silvers. But I just remember a very deep feeling of failure and disappointment, and this sense of having let a lot of people down because I hadn't lived up to what I'd been able to achieve the previous year. And I think it's amazing to me now, especially having had a few years to sort of, get a little bit more experience, that silver medals can feel like failure for some when the pressure is so extreme. But I think that's why Rio was such a big turning point for me, because it was the first time in the athletic world that I hadn't achieved what everyone had sort of hoped I would, or that I hoped I would. And so I had to really face that sense of disappointment face on. And it was incredibly humbling for me, but it was also great motivation for future competitions to sort of really engage with what sport meant to me, and where I wanted to take it.
And then did you ever have anyone come up to you in the very beginning, those first 2 years of competition, and say, you have a real future in this sport? Or was it just kind of assumed because you kept winning in the way that you did?
Yeah, I think there was a combination of both. I think there was a lot of, I think initially a lot of controversy and a lot of backlash I felt from certain like people and certain groups of people around classification was a really big thing. And when you have an athlete sort of come out of nowhere and do really well, that gets thrown into question, and whether or not they deserve to be where they are and if they're there for the right reasons. And so when I was 14, people were sort of saying, like you shouldn't be in this classification, or you don't deserve to be winning these medals. That was like mind-boggling for me. But I think largely and for the most part, people were incredibly excited for me and for what I could go on to do. I think I was still that kid where I was 14 and they were like, oh, you're going to go on to do great things. And I was like, oh yeah, whatever. We'll get there when we get there. Like, let's not talk about 2016 and, 2020 and what that looks like. I was like, I just want to kind of get through this event and celebrate afterwards and go back to school. So yeah, it was a very interesting time where I felt like I was living these two separate lives where people were really excited for me and I didn't really get the hype. I was just kind of doing what I thought I should be doing and what was best.
And then in 2017, you broke another world record at the World Para Championship.
Yeah.
I mean, 3 times.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
that's crazy.
London was incredible. London in 2017 was and still is probably my favorite event that I've ever done. It was just the highlight of my career so far. I think nothing feels better than having a comeback. Nothing feels better than that. And so after Rio, I sort of went away and I sort of, had to think about what I was doing and if I even wanted to be there and deal with that sense of failure and disappointment that wasn't necessarily true, but was certainly true to me. So I think going into London, I felt quite sick actually 2 weeks before I went away. So in terms of expectation and in terms of this sense of pressure, I just didn't really feel it going into that event. So to come away with a world record and 2 gold medals from that was huge, and it was incredibly reassuring to me and quite empowering in knowing that I was capable of being in that place again. And that's it's the whole reason for why you train. It's to see if you can get back to that point. So yeah, it was pretty special.
When you say that you had doubts about failure, what was going through your head? I mean, I wouldn't look at what you've accomplished by 2017 and say Isis is a failure. In fact, it's quite the
Yeah.
opposite. So why were you internalizing that kind of mentality?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I put a lot of pressure on myself to always be the best, and I had this, I guess, idea that anything less than that simply wasn't good enough. It was, it's fine for anybody else, but it's not fine for me, which I think is a very common mentality for a lot of athletes. Because if you don't have that sort of internal drive to kind of want to be the best, then you don't end up there. And I think for me, I was still quite young and I was still quite naive around what I guess doing things for the right reason looked like. And back then I was doing things to obviously please and appease other people. And I think for me, going into Rio, I was like, oh, well, everyone will be happy if I win these events. And then when I didn't, I was like, well, everyone mustn't be happy with me now. And I think that was something that I really had to work on and really had to put a lot of time and effort into to sort of change that mindset. But yeah, going into London, I was a little bit older, but I was still a little bit nervous around what success would look like for me and whether or not that would even feel enough for me, as I began to kind of think about what it looked like and what it might turn into.
And then, I mean, what was the thought process behind getting help and talking to someone about those feelings? I mean, how does Australia handle mental health and seeking assistance?
I think we have quite a good mental health setup here. I knew that in terms of access to psychologists, it is covered by our healthcare services. At least like 10 sessions, I think, are covered for us. So when I first started seeing a psychologist, it was more of like a personal psych. It wasn't a sports psychologist. And so she worked clinically, and I had 10 sessions with her that were effectively free. And so I started seeing her, and she really worked for me. And that was where I sort of started this journey into mental health and psychology. And then for us, through our state institutes of sport, we also have access to sports psychologists. So I had my own personal psych, and then I had this other sports psychologist who could help me more with that, the sports side of things, and that race mentality, that pressure mentality, all of those things. And I guess I looked into it because I knew that so much of it was internal, and I knew that I had all these people congratulating me, and I didn't believe them. And I think that was when I was like, okay, I need to really assess what's going on here. And that was what motivated that for me.
So sometimes when I'm talking to athletes, I'll pick up on things that they say that are more clinical versus applied sports psych.
Mhm.
Like, for example, performance anxiety is not necessarily because of the sport. It appears that way, it manifests that way, but it's not directly actually impacted by how they do. It's impacted by something off the court, off the field, off the track. Was that happening to you, or were you able to delineate, okay, this is my clinical my clinical psychologist versus my performance psychologist? I mean, was
Mm.
there overlap?
I think for me, the differentiation between the two was really important. I liked being able to, I guess, compartmentalize those parts of my life. Um, I I think I'm somebody who can be quite perfectionistic and quite sort of I have this sort of desire to be good at things. Everybody does. And I think when I was at school and I was sort of going through that early high school phase at the same time that I was going through elite sport, um, at the time I started off in a private high school. So at this girls' school, I by far wasn't the best in the class. I wasn't a standout student. I was probably a C, B grade average. And for me, I was like, well, this is how it's always going to be. It's not satisfying, but it kind of is the way it is. And that took a lot of my confidence, I think. I managed to convince myself that I wasn't very good at things. And so when I found sport and found something that I was good at, it was hugely empowering, but it also meant that those moments of perceived failure hit me a lot harder because I thought, I have to be good at something. Eventually, I moved schools, and the school that I moved to was my local high school, and I began to sort of thrive academically. I loved what I studied, and I was good at it, and that further changed this mentality around what being good at something looked like and how much value that had to you as a person. And I think working alongside psychologists that were able to guide me through that and able to sort of center me around values and around self-worth and things like that was vital to my understanding of self and ability to stay in elite sport as well.
And then speaking of staying in elite sport, 2018 comes and you end up breaking your own world record. How does that up the amount of pressure that's now on you? Because now you're not breaking other people's records. You're really setting the standard yourself.
Yeah, and I think that it was an interesting moment for me because realized that I realized a few things. One was that if I wanted to continue being the best in the world, I had to continue being better than myself. And I think that it can be empowering, and it can also be really scary because I knew that I had nobody else to compete against except for me. But I also knew that if I failed in some capacity or didn't show up in some way, that it would be quite obvious, and those records could be taken from me. And it was very much like once you start thinking about it, you just kind of spiral. So that was one side of it. But I think also by 2018, I began to realize my sort of motivation behind sport and my reason for why I was doing it. And that was when it sort of occurred to me that I did feel this sense of having to perform to please other people. And I remember being at the Commonwealth Games in 2018, and I just won my gold medal at that event, and I took it home, or I took it back to the village, and I was sitting on the little couch in our apartment, and it was just me because it was quite late, and I had the medal in front of me on the table, and it was like shiny and beautiful. It was in its box. I was looking at it and I felt nothing. I just looked at it and I was like, this is great, but it doesn't feel like I earned it for the right reasons. And so that was this huge moment of, I guess, realization for me, that I knew that if I didn't take a step back from what I was doing, I would either be doing it continually for the wrong reasons or just learn to hate it. And that was something I really didn't want. And it was really important for me that I could look at that objectively and know that I wasn't in the right place to continue being in the position I was, which was also, it was great that I had the privilege to be able to step back then too.
And then you did take a break until 2020, the Tokyo Paralympics. I mean, how did you feel that time?
Yeah, I mean, I had this, I think, again, it's also really funny in hindsight, but at that point, I'd been competing through the entirety of my teen years, pretty much. So from 12, 13, all the way through to I was around 17 by the time I took a break. And so I had this feeling that while all my friends had been going to school and then going out on weekends and progressively doing more and more things that teenagers do, I was going to training, I was going to bed early, I was trying to eat well, sometimes failing at all of those things. And just feeling like I was missing out. And I just had this sense of everyone's living this incredible teenage dream, and I'm out here training, like I'm missing something. And so I took that break, and for me it was an opportunity to focus on all the things that I had kind of put to the side for all of those kind of years. And it meant that I got to reconnect with equestrian for a little while, which was great. And I got to really apply myself to school, which was something that was and still is really important to me. And I knew that if I was going to do year 12, that my final year of high school, that I really wanted to do the best I could. And I knew the courses I wanted to get into, I knew what I wanted to study, and I knew that if I wanted to do any of those things, I had to kind of put all of myself into that. And that was what I wanted to do. And I knew that. And I think because that reason why was so clear for me, it made it easy to kind of take a step back, because it was where I wanted to be. It was what I wanted to be doing. And it was important that I honored that at the time. So yeah, I guess it was quite simple in hindsight.
And then you talk about the youth that you still had in you and the experiences that you thought you were missing. Were you missing them? Or did you, I mean, like, did they live up to the expectation?
No, of course not. 17-year-olds aren't doing anything cool. Like, I don't know what I thought everyone was doing, but I wasn't missing anything. I think I don't know. I don't even know what I did in that year. I can't even be like, oh, like the parties were great and like the things I did were so exciting. I didn't do any of that. So, I mean, it was nice to have all that time on my hands, but I realized after a while that what I loved to do was train, and what I loved to do was try and master this sport that I was a part of. And while equestrian did fill that sort of need for a little while, it just wasn't quite the same. So it did take a year, but by the end of year 12, by the time I'd kind of done everything I wanted to do with school, I was ready to kind of reassess what it was that I was really passionate about.
I mean, how important was taking that gap year for the entity that is your mental health?
I think it was the difference between a truly happy and fulfilling life for me and something that was done for all the wrong reasons. And mentally, it was great because I had this period of time where the only pressure I had was the pressure that was felt by everybody my age. And that was just that you had to go to school and you wanted to do well and you wanted to pass your exams. And being in this environment where we were all in the same boat was such a relief for me, because I felt like a normal kid for at least a year. And mentally, I was able to sort of just enjoy that. And as soon as I took a step back from this very adult, mature, elite environment, I realized that I didn't have to try and be anybody I wasn't. And I could really think about who I was and what I wanted to do. And it meant that by the time I was making the decision to come back to athletics, I was making that decision for the right reasons and I was really clear on what I wanted. And I think if I hadn't taken that break, that clarity would have been much harder to find.
The underpinnings of a lot of the interviews that I do are an attachment to identity as an athlete. That's why people stay in their sport, even at times when it may get abusive or when it's not right for them or they've aged out of their peak performance. I mean, were you struggling with that identity? Was that one of the things that factored into taking a break, or was that not part of it for you?
Absolutely. I've always said that I accidentally fell into athletics. I accidentally fell into elite sport. And I was never that kid that woke up when they were 8 years old and was like, I'm going to be a Paralympian. I'm going to be out there like those people. I was never that kid. And so finding myself in a position where people were saying, you know, you're inspirational and, you know, my daughter who's 6 really wants to be like you one day. I couldn't empathize with that story. You know, that wasn't my story at all. So I found myself in a position where I was an athlete and I was a very successful athlete, but I just felt like that wasn't who I was. And I felt like I had so much more to offer than just that. And so I think feeling like I was characterized purely by my sport was quite almost upsetting for me because I thought, you know, I have this love and this passion for so many other things. I don't want to just be an athlete. And that was probably part of that realization I had in 2018 was that this isn't all that I am. And yet I feel like that's all people perceive me to be. And that was quite troubling for me. So again, having that time to reassess and be a student, be a girl that rode horses again, and just kind of figure out what it was that I enjoyed meant that I could kind of design my own sense of self for probably the first time.
And then you came back and you set a personal best. You got a silver and another silver, and you left Tokyo with a personal best. I mean, how did that feel, especially considering what the last 2 years had been like mentally for you?
Yeah, it was huge. I mean, I knew that I wanted to come back to athletics at the end of 2019, which was probably just before COVID started. So I had no idea that that was going to play a huge role in our life. But at the time, I had said, and I stood by this, I just said, I will not be competing in Tokyo unless I have the potential to win that event. I will not be there otherwise. And everyone was kind of like, oh, yeah, we'll see. And I was like, no, that's how it's going to be. And so at the start of 2020, I started working with a new coach. And at the time, I was still living in Melbourne and he was in Brisbane. So we were coaching and training between two different states, which meant that for at least, it would have been almost 6 to 8 months, we were doing all of our sessions over Zoom. And it's characteristically cold in Melbourne. The weather is not ideal for sprint training. So I was trekking out to the oval during COVID lockdowns and with a little camera to just kind of film my training for months. And so back then I remember thinking, there's no way I'm going to be where I want to be by Tokyo. And then towards the end of 2020, we decided to make the move to Brisbane. And I moved during huge lockdowns and whatever else was going on. But thankfully, Brisbane wasn't as impacted by COVID as Melbourne was. So there was a lot more freedom up here. And I was able to train with people for the first time in years and work with a coach and do all the things that I hadn't done in a long time. And I really found that passion and that love and that comfort in what I was doing. And then yeah, we just worked really hard and my coach is brilliant and he was able to put together a program that somehow got me to a Paralympic Games within effectively 18 months. And by the time I was at the track, I still didn't believe that I was fast enough to be there. I remember saying to Paul, my coach, about a month before I had to leave, I took him aside and I was like, Paul, I just don't think I'm fast. I'm not running fast enough. And he was like, what do you mean? Like the training, you're all on track to do well, like everything's going fine. But coaches kind of keep their numbers to themselves and they mean nothing to you as an athlete. So I was kind of like, oh yeah, whatever. I'm just saying that to like make me feel better. And then we must have been, again, about a month out from when I was supposed to leave for Tokyo. And I had a race up in Cairns, which is a smaller sort of town in Northern Australia. And there was nobody there. There was literally no one because of COVID. And I unofficially broke the 200-meter world record in Cairns about a month before Tokyo. And there was no one there except him and my physio. And I crossed the line and someone's standing up above the track and they yell out the time. And I was like, oh, well, that must be wrong. And then Paul comes up to me onto the track and he just grabs me and he goes, now do you believe you're running fast? And I was like, oh yeah, I guess so. And then a month later I was in Tokyo and yeah, running PBs that if, you know, someone else hadn't been running faster than me that day would have also been world records. So it was so special and so significant for me to come out in Tokyo and to run like that off of 18 months of training, off of all of this work that I've done with a new coach, with moving for the first time, with the sports psychs that I work with, and just feeling like a completely different athlete in Tokyo.
We were just talking about how you saw silver as a failure. I mean, did that change when you would have effectively broken another world record, but there was someone just a little bit faster than you that day?
Yeah, I mean, that's the nature of my sport. And I think that was something I said a lot in Tokyo and after Tokyo. I knew going into that race that I might win it or that I might not. And I actually sat down with my sports psychologist the day before my 100 in Tokyo, and he was FaceTiming me and he's like, right, how are you feeling? And I just said, Jonah, I'm worried. And he was like, what are you worried about? And I was like, I'm worried I'm worried I'm going to come second tomorrow. And he was like, okay, you know, classic, fair enough. And then I said, but I'm also worried that I'm going to win. And he was like, right, okay. And I think that I guess is sort of, in a nutshell, I think that's what being an athlete is. It's this anticipation for what you're going to do. It's the unknown of what's going to come from that. And so I think when I went to race the following day, I was behind the blocks knowing that I had done everything I could up until that point. I had my training was well and truly done. I had my warm-up done. I had my little mantras going. I was about as prepared as I was ever going to be, given the time and space that we're in. So crossing the line second with the PB, like I knew that I couldn't have done any better than I did that day. And so for me, the silver was a huge reward because it meant that it really did show all of the work I'd put in. Sure, it wasn't gold, but that didn't really matter to me at this point because it wasn't really about that. And I think the fact that I was able to come out, run faster than I'd ever run before, and then have something to show for it was sort of all that mattered to me. And even if I didn't have something to show for it, it was still an achievement. And that's sort of all I was there to do.
How are you training differently for the next Paralympic Games?
I think my coach would tell you that it's a completely different training program now. I mean, we're training harder than we were before. We know my body better than we did before. So we're really experimenting with load and with different kinds of training sessions. And I think for me, that's been a huge mental adjustment just as much as it has been physical, because we're really asking a lot more of my body, which is exciting because, you know, I can't imagine where that's going to put me in 3 years' time. So that's probably the biggest thing. But also, I think mentally continuing to work with the psychs that I've worked with for so long and really start to pull apart the niche sort of little things about the sporting mentality and even just my personal mentality around where I'm at and where I'm going. And you know, you wake up every morning and some mornings you think, yeah, I love what I do, can't wait to go to training. And some mornings you wake up and you're like, why do I do this? And it's being comfortable with that and learning to embrace the fact that you don't wake up as the perfect athlete every day. And in fact, there's no such thing. So there's still little things that we grapple with, but we're definitely working with a lot more than we ever have before.
Is there a possibility that you move to T36? Or are you a
Um,
T35 athlete?
I'm a T35 athlete confirmed. There is an opportunity to compete up a classification if you choose to. For example, my event isn't included at the Birmingham Commonwealth Games this year, but there are some T30 events that are. I think there's a T3800 that's included, and if I really wanted to compete in that, I could. Personally, I don't think I ever would. I'm in the classification that I belong in, and I think that's where I'm comfortable staying. So I think for now, obviously, so long as things stay that way, that's how it'll always be for me. But yeah, there's definitely always room to move around.
What does the future of your disability look like on you as you get older? Because you're 21 now?
Yeah, I think again, it can be different for everybody. It'll be interesting to see how training impacts my CP. It's hard to know right now. It'll probably be something I figure out when I'm a little bit older and I'm not training or competing anymore. Um, Generally, CP tends to sort of stabilize as you stop growing. So that's probably something I've noticed the most as I've picked up training again in my like early 20s, late teens, was that my body was stronger, it was more consistent, it was able to handle more load because it wasn't growing and it wasn't trying to manage CP and growth at the same time. So I think now my sort of baseline CP is far more predictable, and it's more about seeing how much load I can handle and having a look at what burnout looks like on me compared to somebody else. And that's probably been the biggest thing that we've had to adjust to, is that idea of neural fatigue is something we really have to factor into my training. So that might change over time. My capacity to take on more load might increase, it might not. And I guess it's really experimenting with where that limit is, or if there even is one.
Can you walk me through a week of practice? Just generally, I mean, what does Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday consist of? And how much of that is sport training and how much of it is school? I mean, what is the quote unquote perfect balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that balance definitely has looked different for me over the years. And right now I'm on uni break, but when I go back, I'll be studying part time, which is ideal for me at the moment. But I guess for me, if we just run through the week, Mondays are they're a track and a gym day for me. So I'll do a light track session early in the morning, and then we'll go from the track straight into the gym. We'll then do a full gym session, and then from there I usually go into physio, and then Pilates, and then massage, all on a Monday. It changes depending on other things that are going on, but that's where we're kind of at the moment. Tuesday will be another track session, so we're usually there for a while actually. So we're on the track for about 2-3 hours, and then I'll go and do recovery, which is really important for me. So we'll jump in the ice bath for a little bit, and then I'll go back into the gym and do a light gym session. Wednesdays, we're back in the gym again, doing a full strength session. That's usually when I'll get physio or treatment of some kind again. Thursdays, we're back on the track. It's a full track session, then back into the ice bath for recovery. Fridays are generally another gym session. And then if I have Pilates or anything that I've missed earlier that week, that'll go on the Friday, as will any extra physio that I feel like I need before my speed endurance session on a Saturday, which is another track session. Or I think this week it's a hill session, so that'll be fun. And then Sunday is my rest day.
What do you mean by recovery?
So recovery, I think, looks different for all of us. For me, it consists mostly of physical recovery techniques. So that consists of things like physio, massage, ice baths, compression boots, stretching, anything and everything that kind of takes care of the physical body. And then obviously I have things like sports psych to complement all the sort of mental health side of things. But yeah, and sleep as well. That's a huge one. So we try to incorporate significant sort of recovery sessions into each track day to just kind of help us get through the week.
And then you were talking about your part-time schooling. I've seen conflicting news reports. Are you studying psychology or neuroscience?
I know, I wish I did neuroscience. Go psychology.
Right.
So yeah, so I'm doing a Bachelor of Behavioral Science, which is just psych. And I, at the moment, like I said, I'm studying part-time. So that's normally around 2 days of like proper uni work a week, which is pretty good. So yeah, I'll have lectures one day and then 2 classes another day. So at the moment, that seems to work pretty well.
Why were you drawn toward behavioral sciences?
I've been fascinated by psychology ever since I was around, I want to say like 14, 15, ironically, probably around the time I started sport. Um, Initially, it was, funnily enough, it was through books that I was reading. And the main character in these books, he was a clinical psychologist and he worked with different people on different things. And I was fascinated by what he did. And I was fascinated by his capacity to analyze and understand people and human behavior and then explain it in some way. And so before I went into high school, that was really interesting to me. And then I got to high school and I did a bit of psychology in years 11, 10, 11, and 12. So the last, 3 years of high school, and loved it. And I knew, like, from probably, again, the age of like 14, that psych was what I wanted to do. And that never really changed for me. And then when I finished high school, my goal was to get into a Bachelor of Psychology, and I did. And so I started that at Melbourne University, and then transferred up here and kept doing it. And I just never really lost the love or the fascination for the subject.
Was it cool studying the course material and then going to your sports psychologist and kind of talking about it?
Oh my God, I reckon I'm probably the most painful person to work with a psychologist, because I love it and I get so excited about the stuff that we talk about. And there is nothing I love more than going into a session with a psychologist. And I think approaching them with topics of conversation or things that are going on in my life or in my mind that I can't wrap my head around. I think I am notorious for trying to outthink my own thoughts. And so as somebody who's sort of like, I should be able to explain this, like I'm studying psych, this should make sense to me, and it doesn't. And then I talk to a psychologist, a sports psych or a clinical psych, and they kind of guide me in the direction of what's going on. And I have this moment of like, oh, okay, I don't know everything yet. And it's so exciting learning about myself in that way, but also just learning about the field in that way. I had a really funny experience recently. I sat one of my exams for psych, and it was on different frameworks of practice. And afterwards, I had a session with my sports psychologist, and he works mainly in the acceptance and commitment therapy framework. So I sat down with him and we were having a conversation, and I couldn't stop giggling through the whole session. And he was like, "What's going on? Like, what's so funny?" And it was because he was almost literally quoting things that I'd been studying in the lead up to my exam. And it was like someone had given him my notes and said, just slip this into conversation with Isis. And that's what it felt like he was doing. And so when he would drop these buzzwords into conversation, I knew what they meant and I knew what he was trying to say, and he didn't need to explain anything to me. It was like the best feeling ever, just knowing what was going on. So in case you couldn't tell, I get quite excited about psych and about working with people with psychology, because it is fascinating to me.
That's why I was so excited when you were so adamant about speaking with me. I was like, yes, like
Yeah.
she knows what she's talking about, because some athletes that I've had on this podcast aren't as able to articulate their feelings as others. I mean, they don't feel any less, but they can't really put it into words as well. But then when I talk to sports psychologists who are trained in the field and those who are studying psych, because I have had a couple athletes who have used their sports psych experience to catapult them into a psych field. I just think it's very interesting, the conversations that ensue, because it's just like living their life, but also learning and seeing applicabilities throughout their coursework that then they go to practice and they're like, I just learned this in class earlier.
Yeah, and I think that's what I love about it. I mean, my coach also, he's fantastic at working with a lot of different athletes, and he can really tailor his I guess approach to coaching for different people, and the things he says, the way he says them, the way he explains things. Every now and then I pinpoint these little psychology techniques, even really sort of simple ones, and I appreciate that, and I really enjoy seeing how it's applied in a field. And I think sport is probably one of the most obvious examples of where psychology comes into play. I think school is probably another one, or like working with young children. But that's what I loved about it. I love going to class and learning something, or working with my sports psych and then going to training and either playing around with the techniques myself or seeing how somebody else uses them was great in not only helping me learn for myself, but even just learning for my uni course as well. Like, I could really use my own experience to understand the content I was learning.
What does the future of your life look like? I know that's
Good
that's a
question.
huge question, but if you could manifest what the rest of your life looks like, what would it look like?
I would love to obviously finish my degree. I think psychology is something that I will always want to work with or in as a field. Ideally, a few years from now, I would love to be incorporating it into what I do. I think being part of podcasts like this is the start of that, and that was why I was so excited about it. Um, I would love to be able to use those skills that I learn combined with the skills, or I guess experience, that I already have in sport into a career. Um, and I think, ideally, I would love to practice clinically or be able to teach other people these skills that I've picked up on, and be able to share that experience. I think is what I would love to do. So, I mean, we'll see what happens, but yeah, that's kind of the goal.
And then where did you pick up Lightning Bolt Holt from? Because I saw
Yeah,
that and I was like, I have to ask her about this nickname.
yes, that started quite early on. It must have been just before the Rio Paralympic Games. Um, Kurt Fernley, who is quite a well-renowned Australian Paralympian, I'm good mates with him, and he was a real sort of mentor for me through my first Paralympics and first World Champs. And he he's just one of those guys that you meet and you instantly just feel like you're best friends. And so um, he coined the term lightning bolt Holt, and that was my nickname within our little sort of group or our team. And somehow it made its way into an interview somewhere, and and then it never really got dropped after that. So there was always that. I think people like to draw links between like Usain Bolt and Isis Holt, and I think there was just a good ring to it. So that's where that came from, and it seems to have stuck.
Do you like the nickname?
I don't mind it. It definitely could be worse, but I think yeah, it's fun. It's exciting. It gives me an excuse to wear little lightning bolts here and there. So I'm not complaining.
And then the last question I have, which is not necessarily a question, but I saw this quote from you and it says, my ability is bigger than my disability. Why do you feel the need to phrase it like that?
I think I remember vividly the first time I was asked for that quote. I had just come off the track uh, from the World Championships in 2015, and someone was interviewing me, and they go, "Give me a quote that you live by." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, I don't know what to say." And I really thought about it for probably 20 seconds. And my ability is bigger than my disability was something that I'd read a few months beforehand, and it really resonated with me. I think obviously the story of me growing up and never really feeling like I identified as somebody who had a disability, or had the image of a disability that I knew, meant that I always really favored the idea of pinpointing what I could do rather than what I couldn't. And I think that at the time, that's what I was trying to communicate. I think now I have rephrased that somewhat, and I sort of coin it more as the term of more than just this. And it's more or less the same thing, but I guess this idea of being more than just one thing. And I guess back then it was, I am not just my disability, I'm also all the things that I can do. And now it's sort of, I'm not just this one thing that you perceive me to be, I am so many more things than just that. And that's the really great thing about it. So that was definitely where it started. And I think that was the general theme of what I was thinking.
Wow. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention that you don't think that I did with the questions that we have today?
I don't think so. I think you've covered most of it really well. I think the only thing I can really think of is I've started, I guess, creating a little bit more of a portfolio and a bit more of a place to put these conversations that we have and really explore these topics. So I'm launching a website pretty soon with some blogs and things attached to it that explore some of the things that we've been talking about, and my experience with different elements of sports psychology. More than just this is a huge part of that, and exploring identity as being more than just an athlete or a student or somebody with a disability. So that's something I'm really excited to start and to engage people with. So if anybody is interested, I will definitely be keeping that updated on my Instagram. So that's probably the main thing, but I think I've covered everything.
Can you send me a link to put that in the show notes? I would love to support it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
And then I normally say, like, if there's anything that you want to promote, like your website, I'll put links to it in the show notes. If there are any foundations that you would like to kind of give a shout out to, I can put links to any of that kind of stuff in the show notes as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll definitely I'll send some through to you, but that would be great. So thank you.
And then just before we go, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about? Anything that you think that I missed? Anything that you wanted to clarify?
I think I've covered most of it. My only, I guess, piece of advice or anything that I would want people to take away from what we talk about is this idea of not being afraid to ask for help, whether or not you feel like you need it, in the sense of, you might feel like you're really struggling with something, or you might not, or you might be curious as to whether or not you could manage something differently or look at things from a different perspective. And I think, obviously I'm a little bit biased coming from the perspective of a psych student, but never underestimating the power and the, I guess, sense of empowerment that can come with understanding yourself a little bit better, and never being afraid to sort of ask those questions and dig a little deeper. Because I think when I was ignoring those things and ignoring that sense of feeling like I wasn't in the right place or doing the right things for the right reasons, that was when I felt like things were the most difficult, or I had the most pressure on my mental health. So yeah, I guess encouraging people to really think about that and explore it, especially if they're athletes too. Yeah.
This episode will come out on actually Wednesday, the 19th. So 2 days from now.
Oh, that's
And
exciting.
once that comes out, I will tag you in all of the posts. There will be 2 on Instagram and 2 on Twitter. I have your Instagram. Do you have anything that you want on Twitter tagged?
I think
saw that
Instagram
you
probably...
have not. I saw that you have not tweeted since like 2018.
Yeah.
So like, do you have a Twitter that you want me to use, or is your kind of main account via Instagram?
Yeah, Instagram would probably be the main one. Feel free to tag the Twitter if you like, but yeah,
Okay.
It's been fairly inactive for a long time.
Yeah.
So yeah, Instagram would be great.
Okay, perfect. And then yeah, if you have anything else between tomorrow or Wednesday that you wanted to include, anything that you forget about that you wanted included in the narration part of this interview, just DM me and I'll include it.
Awesome. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks so much for hanging out with me tonight / this morning.
This morning. No, it's been great. And I love some of the questions you ask. And I think that's something that I found from working with these. I mean, you're the second podcast that I've worked with that's looked at sports psychology. But the questions are so much sort of deeper, and you really challenge me to think a little bit harder, which I really enjoy. And I hope that people get more value out of that than just sort of tell me your life story. So I also really appreciate that. And I think that what you're doing is really cool.
Well, thank you. You are episode 50 of this podcast. So I've been
Yay.
doing this for almost a year now, and the people that I've been able to talk to are just incredible. Like I feel like I say this every week. Like the people that I get to interview for this podcast are so interesting, and they've been all over the world competing and representing their home countries. I mean, it's incredible. And I'm so excited to add you to the bunch because this interview has been really unique in terms of just what you've been able to do at such a young age and how humble you've managed to stay. I mean,
Thank you.
you're breaking your own world records and still you're like, I don't know, like it's nothing.
They're just PBs.
Yeah, whatever. So
yeah, thank you.
if there's anything else that you wanted to include between now and Wednesday, just update me. And then your phone is about to blow up on Wednesday when I post everything.
Yay, can't wait.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day. And I'll talk
Thank
to you
you, you
soon.
too. Sounds good. Thanks, Julia.
Bye.
Bye.